In this video, I want to talk about the relationship between the self and suffering and happiness. Hi everybody, I'm Bruce Lambert from HowCommunicationWorks.com. This is a channel where I talk about communication skills so you can improve your relationships, succeed at work, and be more confident. In this video, I want to talk about a paradox that's been on my mind a lot lately. So let me give you a little bit of background before I get into it directly. If you've watched some of my other videos, and I'll link to one of them here, I've talked in the past about the relationship between chronic illness and the self. And what happens in chronic illness is our body fails us, then we can't do the things we used to do in terms of our everyday activities, or these performances that make us who we are. So that we call that body failure, and then performance failure, and then we experience loss of self. That is, we can't be the same person who we were before we got sick. So this progression, body failure, performance failure, loss of self, causes a tremendous amount of suffering in people who are chronically ill. Okay, so that's the first part of the paradox. Loss of self appears to lead to suffering. It doesn't really appear to. It's pretty clear that in chronically ill people, loss of self leads to a tremendous amount of suffering, depression, isolation, even suicide. But here's the paradox. A certain number of people who are chronically ill or at the end of life or even under ordinary circumstances, or I guess extraordinary circumstances, seem to transcend themselves. That is, they sort of lose interest in themselves. They become egoless, or they transcend this concern, the narrow concerns that most of us normally have about themselves. They experience what some people call self-transcendent experiences, or they have what some people call self-transcendent experiences, or mystical experiences, or peak experiences, or flow experiences. They go by many different names in the scientific literature and in the popular literature as well. So here's the paradox. On the one hand, in our ordinary lives, we're very concerned with ourselves, that is, with keeping some sense of self-integrity, having a self that we can respect, right? Self-esteem, self-respect, self-love, all this stuff. We're very concerned about keeping ourselves intact, and our happiness appears to be really connected to this sense of ego integrity or self-integrity. And when we get sick and our body fails us and we can't be ourselves, we suffer. But paradoxically, some people seem to be able to overcome the suffering from chronic illness or at the end of life by transcending themselves. There's a whole literature in nursing about self-transcendence, and now this is spreading across psychology and in other places, this idea of self-transcendent experiences. And there's a little bit of difference between what the psychologists call these sort of fleeting self-transcendent experiences, which may not last for more than a few minutes or a few hours, these peak experiences or mystical experiences or flow experiences, which may be fleeting, and the kind of self-transcendence that people sometimes enjoy at the end of life or after long periods of meditation or prayer or other forms of self-discipline. They might enjoy prolonged kind of periods of self-transcendence where their whole attitude sort of changes. But let's first at least talk about this idea of a self-transcendent experience. I just read this great paper by David Yaden and Jonathan Haidt and a variety of others. I'll link to that down in the description. I'll also link to Pamela Reed's stuff on self-transcendent experiences in nursing. So David Yaden and others in their paper, they talk about self-transcendent experiences as being these sort of fleeting, momentary, temporary mental states that have the following characteristics. These self-transcendent experiences, according to David Yaden and his colleagues, involve a reduced sense of self-salience. That's kind of a jargony way to say it. Self-salience means the kind of importance of self, and also a blurring of the boundaries between ourselves and other things. So this enhanced sense of connectedness. So these two aspects, a reduced sense of self-salience or the importance of our own ego or self, and an enhanced sense of connectedness, a kind of blurring of the boundaries between our body, ourselves, and other people, or even the whole universe. People who have these self-transcendent experiences report feeling selfless, being identified with pure experience rather than just ego. It gets to sound a little woo-woo, a little mystical, but this is what it's like for people to have these experiences. So apologies if it sounds a little mystical or new age, but this is what these experiences are like. And in addition to kind of experiencing this selflessness, they also report experiencing greater connectedness to other people, and to the earth, to nature, to animals, and even to all of humanity or to all of existence, and to pure love, etc. People say things like that when they have these experiences. So this is the kind of crux of the paradox that I'm thinking about, and I don't have the solution in this video. I just wanted to talk about it because it was on my mind and wanted to see what your reactions were. So on the one hand, in chronic illness, loss of self causes us tremendous suffering. On the other hand, the kind of solution at the end of life, or when you have a very serious illness and your body has completely failed you, the solution seems to be somehow to transcend yourself and to enter this experience where you don't care so much about yourself. You don't even experience yourself that much as an individual anymore, and you feel this greater sense of connectedness to nature, to God, to humanity, to universal love, to the whole universe, whatever you want to call it. So, this is paradoxical to me. And so that's why, I was thinking of the title for this video, do we have too much self or not enough? Because too much self clearly makes us suffer a lot of the time. A lot of the characteristics of anxiety and depression have to do with an unhealthy obsession with ourselves, rumination, too much focus on ourselves, self-criticism, sort of self-obsession. All of these are associated with negative psychological states of unhappiness and anxiety and despair, whereas these self-transcendent experiences where we don't care about ourselves, our sense of self is sort of expanded infinitely, or we don't even have the experience of being an individual ego. Instead, we just feel connected to the whole universe. These states appear to be associated with very, very positive emotional experiences, happiness, joy, awe, and even long-lasting increases in compassion, altruism, love, generosity, and so on. So this is the crux of the paradox. I'm not sure I totally understand it. It's very, very interesting to me that I think for lots of people in ordinary life, it is important to try to keep your sort of sense of self intact. I don't think we can live our lives in these self-transcendent experiences. At least most people can't. Maybe the Dalai Lama or something, but I think even the Dalai Lama, gets up and brushes his teeth and so on and so forth, and can't live every moment in a self-transcendent experience. So I do think for most of us in ordinary waking life, there is this effort to keep ourselves intact, and a loss of self due to illness or body failure or injury or something like that causes dramatic suffering. Yet, on the other hand, it appears that the ability to transcend these narrow concerns of ego, identity, self is associated with great joy, happiness, contentment, awe, and these experiences which most of us seek, and most of us don't have very often, although many of us have had for some brief period in our lives, whether during prayer, meditation, yoga, visualization, psychedelic experiences, etc. So, okay. How do we actually induce these experiences? If they're so great, how do we actually arrive at them? And there's a wide variety of ways that you can arrive at these experiences. One of the reasons I've been thinking about this so much is because I read Michael Pollan's book about psychedelics. It's called How to Change Your Mind. I cannot recommend this book highly enough. I'll link to the book down in the description below. And he's all over YouTube and on a bunch of podcasts when he was promoting the book. If you don't want to read the book, check out some of the podcasts. He's been on, I think, with Tim Ferriss and James Altucher and others talking about the book, so highly recommended. Well, he talks about taking psychedelic drugs. So this is psilocybin magic mushrooms, or LSD, or mescaline, or peyote, or ayahuasca, or ibogaine, or all these different, MDMA, did I say that already? All these different psychedelic substances which allow you to trip and have these transcendent experiences. And there's researchers now at Johns Hopkins working with people dying of cancer and in other extreme distress from serious illness. They give them psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, under therapeutic conditions. And sure enough, they have these self-transcendent mystical experiences which have tremendously beneficial positive effects on them at the end of life. So I'll link to some of those studies as well, done by people at Johns Hopkins about using mushrooms at the end of life to induce these peak experiences. But I'll give you a list of other ways that you can induce these self-transcendent experiences that if you're not interested in taking psychedelics, which are illegal for the most part. So meditation, mindfulness in meditation, or loving kindness meditation, these are both two ways of achieving certain kinds of self-transcendent experiences. Prayer, yoga, music and dance, especially choral singing and ensemble dancing, experiences with nature where you can experience awe, something much greater than yourself. Journaling, taking psychedelics like mushrooms or LSD or mescaline or peyote or MDMA or ayahuasca, etc. I'm not necessarily recommending that. I'm just saying that is one way people induce these experiences. Going on certain kinds of retreats, even brain stimulation, we may be able to. Obviously, when you take psychedelic drugs, all they're doing is altering certain neurotransmitters in your brain and producing these self-transcendent experiences. So you may be able to do the same thing by just directly stimulating parts of the brain electronically. So those are some of the sort of tried and true methods for inducing these self-transcendent experiences. Again, recommending Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, and I'll link to these other papers that I've talked about. So that's it. There is this strange paradox having to do with ourselves, that on the one hand, when we get sick and we experience loss of self, it clearly makes people depressed, isolated, and it makes them suffer. And on the other hand, being able to achieve these self-transcendent experiences where we don't care so much about ourselves, it's even more than that, where we don't even experience ourselves as having a distinct ego. We feel connected, a much diminished sense of being an individual, and this much enhanced sense of connectedness to other people in the world and the universe seems to bring great solace and comfort and lasting joy and satisfaction and altruism, even at the end of life. So I think this is an amazing contradiction. I'm not sure exactly what to make of it, because it does still seem so paradoxical to me that on the one hand, we need a coherent sense of self, and on the other hand, maybe some of the best experiences of being a human being are available to us only when we transcend our sense of self. So let me know down in the comments what you think of self-transcendence. Have you experienced a self-transcendent moment in your life? If so, tell me how you got into that experience. Was it a mystical experience? Was it a drug-related experience, or prayer, or music, or how did it happen, and what effect did it have on you in the short and the long term? If you like videos like this, you can subscribe to our channel, like this video, subscribe, click the bell notification, go on over to howcommunicationworks.com, sign up for our mailing list. We'll send you an ebook about empathy, and we'll occasionally email you about new videos and new articles on the blog. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.